Here you see a photograph that I'm going to use to demonstrate to you how to approach drawing a subject. And what you need to focus on are the shapes of the subject. And not the small shapes, but the big shapes. First, look for the overall shape of the subject. So looking at the trees here, for example, don't look at the individual trees, but rather look at the overall shape that all of these trees make, which is this. So when you begin your drawing, you focus on that overall shape. And then you need to decide as to where that shape should be placed. So one way to help you in deciding as to where to place the various shapes is to use a plan of subdivision. There are two kinds of subdivisions. There's the informal subdivision, and then there is the formal subdivision. The formal subdivision results in a symmetrical subdivision of the picture area, and the informal subdivision results in an asymmetrical subdivision of the picture area. So I'm going to show you the informal subdivision, and what this method of dividing the picture area does for you is to provide you with lines that suggest to you where to place various shapes. And this kind of informal subdivision of the picture area will result in a variety of different sizes of shapes that adds interest to the picture. Begin by dividing the picture area with a vertical line, and it's best to avoid placing the line at a point which would be 1/2, 1/3, or 1/4 of the whole space. So don't divide the picture area like this right down the center. That would result in two shapes that are of equal size. And also, as I mentioned, avoid dividing the picture area into thirds, or 1/4 of the whole space. So I'm going to place a vertical line about right there. Then the next line to draw is a diagonal. And you draw that diagonal from one corner of the whole to another corner. So this is the whole space, and you're drawing a diagonal from one corner to the other corner of the whole space or picture area. Now draw a horizontal line at the intersection of the diagonal and vertical, which is right there. And now draw diagonals in any of the resulting rectangles, but only one to a space. Two diagonals crossing like an X, like this, would divide the rectangle equally, which is not what you want. Rather, you divide the space like this, going to this corner here, and not to this corner. Now draw another diagonal, but again, like I mentioned before, don't draw the diagonals within the rectangle shape, because then you will end up with that X like this. Here I'm drawing from one corner to the other corner for this rectangle shape, and then I'm adding another diagonal, again running from one corner to the other within this rectangle. And that's wrong, because you don't get enough variety of different sized shapes that way. So therefore, I would draw my diagonal starting here at that corner, but then going down to the corner of this other rectangle right there. See that rectangle shape? But I'm going to that corner and not this corner. Then if I draw another diagonal, I'll draw that diagonal not to that corner there like I mentioned, but rather to this corner here of this rectangle. Then I can go ahead and draw horizontal and vertical lines where different lines intersect, like here, for example. These diagonals intersect, and therefore I can draw a vertical line right through that intersection like that. I can also draw a horizontal line through that intersection. And you can see this network of lines being created, subdividing the picture area, and creating this framework of lines upon which I can then build my composition, because these lines suggest to me where I can place shapes. You can add as many of these lines as you feel you need to begin placing your various shapes and forms. And you're not just restricted to diagonals, verticals, and horizontals, but you can also draw in curves if you want, like this. And maybe a curve over here, going to that corner, from this corner to this corner. And those curves can also aid in the placement of different shapes. This kind of subdivision of the picture area offers a great deal of suggestion for the placement of figures, spacing, and contours, with no two spaces being exactly equal or duplicated except the two halves on each side of the single diagonal, which is this diagonal that I'm talking about. This half is the same size as this half, and that goes for other diagonals as well, such as this one here, which divides this rectangle shape into two equal halves, here and here. But otherwise, the shapes created through this kind of subdivision are of unequal sizes, and therefore creates a lot of variety of different sizes of shapes. And this adds a lot of interest to a composition. This is a method whereby you can begin a composition. Instead of starting out with a blank area, blank picture area like that, where you have nothing that suggests to you where you can place shapes, you begin with something that can act as a way through which you can come up with ideas for the composition. When you have a subject in mind, build your subject by adhering as much as possible to the structural lines or network of lines that you create through this subdivision of the picture area. You can also add circles or ovals within this framework. So I could maybe add an oval to this shape here. Let me just change that to a red or an orange. And you see this rectangle shape. And I could add an oval into that shape like this. And then a circle up here into that shape. And maybe another circle, setting up a rhythm of circles. And you can see that a structure is being built that consists of circles and rectangles, squares, and triangles. And as I mentioned before, this structure serves as a guide to where you can place your shapes. It suggests to you where you might place a shape. And what you also need to do is you select certain lines that you're going to use where you're going to place your shapes, and you ignore other lines. You don't necessarily use every line within this structure. You pick and choose which lines you're going to use where you're going to place your shapes. I could even add a larger oval or circle. Let's say I can pick this shape here. And within that shape, I could add a large circle. And you see that it gets quite complicated with all of these lines. But as I mentioned, you pick and choose which lines you're going to use for your composition. They suggest ideas to you, as I said. I should mention that you don't necessarily need to add circles, ovals, and these curved lines to this structure of horizontals, verticals, and diagonal lines. It all depends on what kind of composition you have in mind. Does that composition call for curved lines and circles and ovals? Or can you do without them? Usually, when a composition is planned with this kind of framework, these circles, ovals, and curved lines are usually not added. But as I mentioned, you can add them if you think that your composition is going to need them. Now let me begin another structure. And again, I begin with a vertical line first. And these lines are added at random. You're not following any specific kind of proportions that are required, such as in dynamic symmetry. Dynamic symmetry consists of certain proportions that are adhered to. And these proportions were established by the ancient Greeks, and they invented dynamic symmetry. This structure here is similar to dynamic symmetry, but it's not dynamic symmetry because it doesn't really use those proportions that dynamic symmetry uses, as I mentioned. This network of lines creating this framework is referred to as informal subdivision and not dynamic symmetry. It's informal because it is an asymmetrical structure rather than a symmetrical structure. You could create a symmetrical structure, and many pictures are based on a framework that has a symmetrical structure to it. And what you would then do is you would then divide the picture area down the middle like this with a vertical line, and then you would begin to add your diagonals, and by doing that you are establishing a symmetrical framework. You see, this part or side of the picture area looks exactly the same as this side does. So you could use this kind of structure to build your composition on. However, that might result in a rather static composition that just doesn't have enough variety of sizes, of shapes, because the left and the right look too much the same. But in informal subdivision like this, you don't have that kind of left and right sides that look exactly the same. So therefore, you get more variety and a more dynamic framework structure than if you use the symmetrical framework structure. However, this kind of symmetrical framework structure does come in useful when you want to create a mood, a religious mood, for example, and usually if you paint a religious subject, as the old masters used to do, they based their compositions on this kind of symmetrical structure. And now I'll give you another example by subdividing this picture area here, creating an informal subdivision, as it's called. But remember that it is best to avoid placing the line at a point which would be 1/2 or 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole space, like that. So these lines are added at random, avoiding those places that I just mentioned. So that first line would be placed over here maybe. Doesn't have to be placed there, I could place it here. I'm avoiding that halfway mark and that 1/3 or 1/4 mark of the whole space. Then the diagonal is drawn all the way over from this corner to that corner. Then a horizontal is drawn right through the intersection of the diagonal and vertical. And then I could add a diagonal like this, coming down to that corner right there. Remember, avoid creating X's like this by drawing diagonals within the shape. You need to draw that diagonal outside of the shape going over into another shape like this and to the corner. Just have to get it right. And then I could draw a vertical line right here where the intersection is. I could also draw a horizontal line through that intersection. You draw those lines wherever those intersections occur. And then I could draw a diagonal starting from that vertical over to this corner here. And maybe another vertical there, horizontal here. You can add as many or as few lines as you want. I could add another vertical here. Then I could add a diagonal from this corner down to that corner over here, like this. Maybe another horizontal right there. So you keep adding if you think you need more lines for your composition. Then once you have enough of these lines, then it's time to start thinking about where you're going to place your shapes. So by having this kind of framework structure, you're beginning with something that can guide you as to where to place your shapes and forms, and you're not beginning with an empty area or an empty shape like this, where nothing is suggesting to you where you can place your shapes. But this network of lines here can suggest to you where to place the shapes, as I mentioned. So if you started like this, and many artists start this way, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's good if you have a little help, like this kind of structure, that can make things a bit easier and help you to end up with a composition that is more unified, that holds together better. A composition, in other words, that appears more cohesive. And using this kind of underlying framework structure can help you to achieve that. When you draw these lines, draw them very lightly. Don't draw them dark like I did here, because if you then add shapes to these structures, you'll hardly be able to see the shapes that you're adding. So therefore, the lines need to be added very lightly, and what I'm going to do is lower the opacity here to make those lines very light, like this, so that you can't see them that well, but you still see the structure. Something like that. And now, when you start drawing your shapes with a darker line, they'll show up against this structure. But before I start drawing any lines, I'm going to add a frame, a darker line for the frame, like this. Now it's time to add shapes. And I'm using this photo here as my reference. But you also need to understand that you can place shapes anywhere within the structure that you created. However, if you don't know composition, then you're not going to be able to create a successful picture. So many beginners, so many students of art, they don't want anything to do with composition for some reason, and that is the most important part of art. Beginners just want to put down paint or just draw without any understanding of composition. And it doesn't work that way. There is no such thing as a really good work of art or great work of art without great composition. The two go together. You can't separate one from the other. If it's a good piece of art, it has good composition. So knowing composition, the artist looks at the reference material and then thinks about what needs to be changed. And 99.9% of the time, you just can't copy the photograph as it is. What you end up with is not a work of art. What you end up with, if you do that, is just a facsimile of the photograph. So, knowing composition, you know that, first of all, you need to establish a dominant size. There are many dominances within a composition, and dominance of size is one important aspect of composition. So therefore, I need to think about what is going to dominate in terms of size in the drawing that I'm going to do here. Should it be the boat? Should it be the land area here? Or the trees? I think what I'm going to do is have the trees dominate. Now, I might change my mind later on, but right now I'm starting to think, well, I think the trees should dominate. So let me go over here to this framework structure, and then I'll start adding the shape of the trees. But the way to begin is not to draw the individual trees that you see here. Rather, think in terms of the overall shape that all of these trees make. You see that overall shape there? Begin by drawing that. So I'm going to start drawing the overall shape, and like I mentioned earlier, you select certain lines and reject others that will be the guides for the placement of your shapes. So I'm thinking maybe something like this, down to that horizontal line. So here's the overall shape of those trees. And then I can go in there and I can start adding or subdividing that overall shape into the smaller shapes of the trees. Now, you don't have to adhere to these guidelines exactly. You can go outside of them or add new ones, or think about, well, maybe I should use different guidelines, not what I did here. Maybe I should do something different. Maybe something like this, or maybe something like this. See, I'm following that diagonal, but I'm not going right up to that diagonal. So I don't have to adhere to those guidelines exactly. But it's a good idea to try to conform to them as much as possible. If I don't like what I did, I could just eliminate it and start over. And let's say I can do something like this, and then add the boat over here. See, that horizontal is my guideline for placing the boat. And then this vertical line is where the back of the boat is. And then I can add the top of the boat here, just roughing it in like this. The trees lead down to the boat. Then I could add the individual shapes of the trees, and I'm just roughing this in, as you can see. Not trying to draw a pretty picture here, just trying to show you how this subdivision of the picture area can be used to arrange your shapes, to create a composition. Then I can go in there and I can make changes to the contour of the overall shape, as you can see. Now, starting with the overall shape of the subject is just one way of starting to draw the subject. This is just one method. You don't have to start with the overall shape, but many times it's easier if you do start with the overall shape. You could, however, just begin with one shape that is part of that overall shape. So I could begin with a tree. And again, using those guidelines for the placement of the trees. And then you add one tree to the next and to the next. Again, I'm using the guidelines to place these tree shapes. And I'm using that diagonal right there that you see to place the tree shapes. See the tops of the trees end about where that diagonal is. Then smaller trees way back here. And then down here I could add the boat. Let's say the back of the boat is right there where this vertical line is. And I could come over more to this vertical line instead. I don't have to follow these lines, but they can help, as I mentioned, in getting ideas as to where to place your shapes and create an interesting composition. Looking at this subdivision here, I see this horizontal line, and I'm thinking, well, maybe I could add those distant trees, these right there. So I'm adding those distant trees roughly to where that horizontal line is. That horizontal line gave me the idea of placing those trees in about this position here. And then I could add tone. Lighter tone for the trees that are further back. Darker tone on those trees that are up front. And then a tone on the boat. Also on the riverbank here. And a suggestion of the water. This is a very rough sketch. Don't have to do a finished drawing here to show you how this subdivision of the picture area can be used. And I can then go in there and make some changes where changes need to be made, such as right here where the riverbank is. And you'll notice that I made that riverbank much more narrow in height than what you see in the photograph. And this is where composition comes in. Knowing that you can change certain things, that you don't have to copy what is in the photograph. You can change it in all sorts of different ways. You're not bound by the photograph. You need to make a good composition. And if that photograph doesn't have a good composition, then you need to know how you can improve that photograph to make a better composition. I think I'll place a figure on the boat. Now, the question is, where should I place that figure? Well, I see a vertical line right there where that subdivision of the picture area is. And that gives me the idea to place the figure right there where that vertical line is. Now you see, if that vertical line was not there, I may have thought of putting that figure somewhere else. But that vertical line gave me the idea to place the figure where that vertical line is. And in addition, I'm thinking of adding some birds. Now where do I place the birds? Well, I see this diagonal line here, and I'm thinking, well, I could place some birds along that diagonal line. So you see how those lines help me in placing these various shapes and arriving at a composition. As I mentioned before, you don't have to use all of the lines in the framework structure. You decide which lines you're going to be using and which lines you're not going to use. So some of these lines, like this diagonal down here, I'm not going to be using unless I decide to put something down here in this corner. Maybe a rock or something like this. If I decide to do that, then I could use that diagonal and place that shape of the rock where that diagonal is. Now, placing the edge of that rock along that diagonal line creates a negative shape arrow. You see this? That negative space or negative shape, it creates an arrow-like shape that's pointing down into the corner and out of the picture area down here. So that's not good. I can change the shape of that rock. I'm not bound by that diagonal line that I have to place the edge of that shape where that diagonal line is. I can ignore that diagonal line and do something like this. Now I've eliminated that negative shape there, that arrow-like shape. So if I don't want to follow a particular line of division, I don't have to. I can ignore it and do something different. For the most part, however, you should try to conform to those lines, to that underlying framework structure of lines and shapes, in order to create a continuity of line, as it's called, which helps to hold together all of the various shapes, tie them together, in other words, to form a more cohesive and unified whole. That's what this continuity of line does. You should also understand that the structure that you create, such as this one here, for example, that I made, may not be suitable for the subject that you want to paint. So this subject here, I don't think is going to work very well for this kind of structure. So if you think that structure isn't the right one, then you just quickly do another one. And it goes rather fast. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. If you know what you're doing, you can quickly create another structure and then use that one and see if that structure works better. Let's say you did make a structure like this and it looks like it might not work for the subject that you have in mind. But remember what I said, that you choose and pick which lines and shapes you want to use and which you don't want to use. Therefore, even a structure like this that looks like it might not work for this subject may work for that subject if I decide to use only certain lines and shapes and ignore others. Therefore, let's say maybe I could do something like this, where I use this horizontal and that horizontal to place my shape of the trees. But I'm ignoring the circle and the curved lines and the ovals, and I'm just using, for now, the horizontal lines. And then down here, right about there, and maybe over here, let's say, I add the boat, very small in size though, so I'll have to do some erasing here. That was a little too large. A very small boat and big trees. Doing this really quick, as you can see. So those trees make this horizontal overall shape like that, going in the direction that the boat is going in. And then I just have to vary the contour a little bit more to get more variety of sizes or height. Some trees are higher, some are lower. That adds a more interesting contour. The boat, I think, is too small and centered too much, so I can make some changes. Lower that riverbank like that, and then add the boat right there. Coming down with the boat, enlarging the boat, in other words, making it much larger. Here's a vertical line right there. So maybe I could have that edge of the boat align somewhat with that vertical line of division. I'm doing this really quick. So now I have the light value of the boat against the darker value of the riverbank and trees. And here you see that horizontal division and it aligns somewhat with the riverbank line right there, and with the top of the boat, like that. But I have to be careful to avoid any tangents. And I could add a figure, like I did in the other example. And again, I could add that figure where this vertical line is. This overall shape of the trees that you see isn't as interesting as it could be if I added some more variety of sizes. This shape is a bit too regular looking, so I need to create a bit more irregularity, and I could do that maybe by adding some larger trees here in the foreground, going up to that diagonal line that runs across the picture area. See, that diagonal line is my guide as to where to place those larger foreground trees. And then I have the smaller trees further back. So here again, one of the subdivisions gave me the idea to add these larger trees to about where that diagonal line is, that subdivision. And then I could lighten the value of those trees that are further back, and the ones that are even further back, I add an even lighter tone to them, thereby creating a greater feeling of depth. I think I'm going to add some birds to this scene, just as I did in the other drawing. And maybe I can use this curve here that I see. I'll place the birds roughly along that curve. And maybe a couple of birds on that other curve, like this. So you see now the curves have served a purpose, whereas before I thought those curves weren't going to be needed for this particular composition. But you never know. As you continue to develop the composition, lines that you thought you weren't going to use, you may end up using. Now I'm going to add some far distant trees, which you see here in the photo. And where do I place them? Well, that horizontal line there suggests to me that I could place those far distant trees right about there. Once you've finished with your composition, then it's time to eliminate that network or framework of lines that you established. You don't need those anymore, so that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to eliminate them. And then I could add maybe some tone here to the sky area like this, like I did in the other drawing. Grading the tone, letting it get lighter as it moves down toward the horizon. Also a little more tone on the water here. And I could continue working on this, but it's time to end this video. I hope you'll try this method, and I think you're going to find it very useful.